Hi, my name is Mr. Deely. I teach 6th, 7th, and 8th grade social studies in District 12 up in the Bronx. Today, we are going to be looking at a lesson that can be used for 8th graders, but also might be useful for high schoolers who are studying American history. We are going to look at how different groups of people created change in the nation during the Cold War from 1955 through 1975. So the first thing we need to do is look at a vocabulary word, and that is the Civil Rights Movement. This was the fight to get all Americans equal rights. So there were three main approaches for creating change during the Civil Rights Movement. During the Cold War, many Americans asked why they should fight for freedom overseas while receiving unequal treatment at home. They created civil rights organizations to fight for equality using a variety of tactics. The first tactic was radical action. This was direct action which challenged social norms, including taking over public buildings, carrying guns, and feeding the poor outside of government assistance. The picture on the right shows a group of American Indian protesters who took over a government building in DC to protest unfair treatment at government hands. A second tactic was coalition building. Coalition building meant convincing others to support their cause through marches, speeches, and boycotts. The picture on the right shows the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a advocate of coalition building and was very successful at building coalitions, groups of people who supported his cause. The third approach was legal action. This involved suing the government to change unfair laws. The picture on the right shows Thurgood Marshall, the gentleman in the center, after he won a case in the US Supreme Court to end the segregation of schools, to end the practice of making black and white kids go to different schools. Many groups used a combination of the three strategies outlined above. So the first movement we are going to look at today, we're going to look at three. Actually, four, my bad. We're going to look at four. Is the African American Civil Rights Movement. We'll start with a little vocab about it. Segregation was the practice of separating people based on race. A boycott is refusing to buy goods or services from a company you disagree with. And nonviolent resistance is fighting to change a system without violence. So, the Civil War ended slavery, but it did not end racism. Southern states passed new laws to keep black and white people unequal. This was called segregation. The photo on the right shows a segregated public drinking fountain where the fountain labeled for white people has an enclosed bottom with a cooling system, while the fountain labeled for people of color does not have a cooling system and is much older. Now, this wasn't just in the South. Even in the North, racism was widespread. Banks refused to give loans to residents of non white neighborhoods. This was called redlining. And you can see it on the map on the right. This is a map of New York City with a bit of New Jersey thrown in. And you can see that there's a grade. A is in green, which is the first grade. B is the blue, which is the second grade. The third grade is in yellow. And the fourth grade, which is given a D, is in red. If you look at the map, you see a lot of areas outlined in red. These were the areas that were predominantly non white residents, and they were not given loans by the bank. Now, people organized to fight this racism. Groups led by people including Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis staged nonviolent bus boycotts and lunch counter sit ins in the 1950s. The goal of these movements was to build a coalition by showing how unfair and unjust the laws were. Dr. King's hope was that if he could make it clear to Americans that the segregation laws were unfair, they would join him and help change the laws. One thing I want to make very clear: just because they weren't using violence does not mean that people were not putting their lives on the line and that they were not being physically brave. Dr. King was arrested for taking part in the bus boycotts. And at the lunch counter sit ins, where college kids would go and sit at white only lunch counters, they were risking their lives. People attacked them for sitting there, they would beat them, they would throw things at them. And when the police showed up, they would not arrest the people who were attacking the protesters, they would arrest the protesters. Some groups felt that in light of all of this, nonviolence was not enough. Leaders like Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party encouraged African Americans to be proud of their heritage and to be prepared to defend themselves with violence if necessary. This approach led to more radical action, where groups like the Black Panther Party would openly carry guns as a form of self defense, but would also take actions that the government was not, such as providing free breakfasts in schools in their communities. Finally, legal action was also paying off. In 1954, the Supreme Court made segregation illegal in Brown versus Board of Education, and in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, outlawing discrimination based on race, sex, color, or nation of origin. Now, African Americans were not the only group fighting for their rights in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There was also an American Indian rights movement. We'll look at some vocab, then we'll get in the story. American Indian is a term for people whose ancestors lived in the Western Hemisphere before 1492. So the Western Hemisphere is all of the Americas, both North and South. They are also called Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, or First Nations. I am using American Indian because it is the term used by many of the groups we are talking about. Native American is very popular today. Indigenous peoples is also popular among many groups, and First Nations is used in Canada. So, a tribe is a group of people connected by family, tradition, and history. And a sovereign government is a group of people with the right to govern themselves. An important thing to know is that many American Indian tribes were promised that they would be sovereign governments in treaties with the United States. This meant that many American Indian tribes have the right to govern themselves. Now, the United States government has broken treaties with American Indian nations since the Washington administration. In the 1960s, young people from American Indian nations across the continent had had enough. They decided that they weren't going to just sit around and watch as, particularly, the US government continued to break the agreements it made with their tribes, and they joined together in the Red Power movement. The movement's goal included celebrating Native culture, increasing tribal autonomy, and restoring treaty rights. They were trying to celebrate their culture through the way they dressed, the way they acted, the way they danced, the way they sang, and hoped that increasing tribal autonomy, so tribes' abilities to make their own decisions, would help them get back the rights that they had been promised by the US government. And one thing to note, a lot of the people in this movement were very young. All of these movements we're looking at. So in 1969, a group called Indians of All Tribes occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay for 19 months. Their goal was a combination of coalition building by raising awareness of the treaties the United States had broken and radical action. The Indians from all tribes said that in treaties, the US government had promised any unused federal land could be used by American Indians, but had not kept their part of the promise. As a result, the Indians of all tribes said they were taking the old prison on Alcatraz Island as their right under these treaties. They came to the prison, they painted over the old sign, and they set up a community. In the pictures on the right, you can see people chilling out, playing basketball and football, and on the bottom, you can see people cooking and eating dinner. Now, at first, the government just kind of ignored the occupation. They were like, hopefully, they'll go away. But as the months passed and it became obvious that they were not going to just go away, President Nixon sent representatives to negotiate with the Indians of all tribes. Now, the negotiations broke down, and in 1970, the protesters went home, but the Red Power movement continued. They continued marching, they continued occupying different buildings, they continued with legal action, radical action, and coalition building. And the legal action paid off. In 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self Determination Act and educational assistance. This act promised an increase in tribal self rule and a renewed commitment to sovereignty. In the picture on the right, you can see the President of the United States, Richard Milhous Nixon, shaking hands with American Indian leaders after the passage of the act in 1975. So, along with the movements we've talked about so far, there was another movement growing up in the American Southwest, and this was the Chicano rights movement. Chicano is a term used by many Mexican Americans to identify themselves. It can also be spelled Chicano with a X in the front. Following the Mexican American War, the additions of California, Texas, and many other formerly Mexican lands to the United States created tensions between families who had lived on that land for generations and newcomers who moved in after it became part of the United States. Many of the Mexican American families who had lived on the land or who had moved to that land from Mexico faced discrimination They saw signs like the one on the right, where businesses would only serve white people and would refuse to serve anyone who spoke Spanish. So, in the 1960s, Mexican American families had had enough and started to fight back. This movement was called the Chicano movement. Farm workers, many of whom were Mexican American, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, staged strikes to improve working conditions in the fields. Their group was called the United Farm Workers. Additionally, students started to speak up. At this time, it was illegal for students to speak Spanish in public schools. Students could be hit for speaking Spanish. If you see underneath the paddle the teacher is picking up there, it says, if it's not worth saying in English, it's not worth saying at all. On top of this, the graduation rate for Mexican American students was much lower than for their classmates. In 1968, high school students in East LA had had enough. They walked out of their schools and refused to return until the school changed its racist rules. They wanted to be able to speak Spanish in the classrooms, they wanted more Spanish speaking teachers, and they wanted to learn Mexican and Mexican American history in the classrooms. These walkouts were called the East LA walkouts or the Chicano blowouts. And once again, I'm going to note the people making this change happen are young people. It's high school students in this case. So the protests of the Chicano rights movement led to legal reforms in the state of California. Cesar Chavez did a great job building a coalition around the farm workers. The radical action of the high schoolers paid off, and the legal action followed. In 1963, aid to families with dependent children was extended to farm workers, and in 1975, the California Agricultural Labor Relations Act was passed. Now we're going to look at one final group today, and that is the LGBT plus rights movement. So, LGBT plus stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and more. This is an umbrella term for groups that include people who were discriminated against based on who they were romantically attracted to and based on their gender identity. In the 1950s and 60s, LGBT plus people were not allowed in most bars. The few bars they were allowed in were run by the mafia and had to pay the police to stay open. Even with the payoffs, police still raided bars and harassed LGBT plus individuals, particularly young people of color. In the Village, a neighborhood in Manhattan, a bar called Stonewall Inn served LGBT plus customers. Many customers were young people who lived in the area. On June 28, 1969, the New York Police Department raided the bar, arresting patrons. Customers and bystanders fought back, throwing bricks. Fighting between the police and community members in the village continued for days. Individuals including Marsha P. Johnson and Stormy DeValier helped lead the uprising. This radical action of fighting back against the police for discrimination led to change. By July 3rd, the fighting had stopped, but news coverage inspired LGBT plus organizations across the country. Pride parades are held in June to raise awareness of issues and to build coalitions, and also to honor those who fought at Stonewall during the riots. This activism led to legal and medical changes, with same sex attraction being removed from a list of mental illnesses in 1973. So, we're now going to summarize what we've gone over in this lesson. During the 1950s and 1960s, many Americans fought for their civil rights. They used a variety of tactics to find success in their struggle. These tactics included radical action. This was direct action which challenged social norms. This included taking over public buildings, carrying guns, and providing services the government did not, like feeding the poor. Another approach was coalition building. This was convincing others to join and support your cause through marches, speeches, and boycotts. The third approach was legal action. This included suing the government to change unfair laws. Many groups used a combination of the three strategies outlined above. The success they found has made our nation stronger and more inclusive. As you can see on the right, people are still fighting for change today. What is something you would like to see change, and how could you use these three tactics to help make that change happen?